I do not address the existence, causes, or magnitude of global warming. Instead, we assess the likely impacts on global supplies of food and timber of a rise in average temperatures, along the lines of what the IPCC is expressing. Well, much of what has been written about the effects of global warming amounts to a lesson in how not to do environmental economics. In particular, erroneous analysis rests squarely on the assumption that people do not adapt at all as the climate changes. This is a convenient premise, however. The premise that people are passive and impractical allows for a very simple measure of the agricultural impacts of global warming. In contrast, the best studies of the consequences of higher temperatures for agriculture and forestry do not neglect adaptation, which, needless to say, is a salient feature of any successful economy. An important lesson of these studies is that opportunities for adaptation are created by free trade. This is an illustration that features two commodities, corn and wheat, as well as a pair of nations, Russia and the United States. Wheat happens to grow better than corn in cooler weather, so a rise in temperatures would reduce the acreage planted in the United States, but increase the area in Russia, where most farmland is closer to the North Pole. Meanwhile, plantings of corn would increase in the United States and decline in Russia. This is the important thing. International trade can be counted on to dampen the price adjustments resulting from these changes from changes in agricultural land use. Again, more wheat grown in Russia, more corn grown in the United States. For example, consider the impacts of a larger wheat harvest in Russia. A larger harvest would drive down domestic prices of that commodity. However, there would also be increased wheat exports, which would push up the domestic market value of the commodity. Russia would also import more corn, which would restrain any increases in that product's price. And there would be actions on the demand side. On the demand side of the market, these changes would prevent relative prices from changing very much. For example, if corn became much more expensive in Russia while the market value of that wheat remained the same, then livestock producers would change the rations fed to cattle and other domesticated animals. As they did this, demand for corn would decline, hence bring down its price, and demand for wheat would increase, thereby putting upward pressure on its market value. So the bottom line here is that relative prices stay pretty much the same. Note that even in the absence of a large swing in relative prices or terms of trade, farmers face a strong incentive to adapt in just the right way to climate change. Consider an individual who's been raising wheat in Iowa. With wheat yields falling and the ratio of corn prices to wheat prices not changing much, switching to corn is attractive. Meanwhile, additional land is being sown to wheat at higher latitudes in Russia. In each case, market forces are promoting exactly the right response to a warmer environment. Well, since trade ought to limit the effects of global warming on prices of agricultural commodities, and pretty much all the research is showing that, Mendelsohn and other economists have focused on the impacts of climate change on the value of agricultural real estate. Now, the value of agricultural real estate obviously depends not only on prices, but on cost of production as well. And in some places, cost of production will go up. In other places, cost of production will go down. And the research clearly shows, and there's actually a large literature on this in major economic journals. The literature clearly shows that property values will be less affected in regions and nations that trade freely than in places that are economically isolated. Well, just as they can adapt to warming, farmers are able to deal with diminished water availability in various ways. However, they will do so only if prices are efficient. In contrast, adjustment to the drier conditions that higher temperatures will create in many settings is less likely if prices are distorted by irrigation subsidies, for example. Technological advances have had a huge impact on agricultural yields in the past. Consider the United States. Around the middle 1930s, farmers started to use hybrid seeds, inorganic fertilizer, and so forth. And since the 1930s, as our agricultural labor force has gone down by 75%, as agricultural land use has consistently gone down, then our production, our yields have gone up by a factor of 5 to 6. Same thing has happened for the same reason at an international scale. Here you see trends in the global average cereal yield since the early 1960s. As you can see, the global average cereal yield has gone from about 1.5 metric tons per hectare. That yield more than doubled. Well, relative to this growth in yields, impacts of global warming on cereal yields are very likely to be negligible. While there's little agreement on the pattern and timing of impacts in specific locations, the ecologists consulted by the IPCC agree unanimously that climate change will affect forest structure and function profoundly. There's an important caveat here. By and large, the ecologists' findings are based on research undertaken in unmanaged ecosystems. However, most of the world's forests have been heavily influenced by human management. Bottom line, it's very unlikely that global warming will have catastrophic consequences for timber production, even in the absence of human adaptation. At present, estimated impacts range from small and negative to large and positive, and management by foresters will further contain any negative impacts which might arise. Well, if mitigating global warming is burdensome, as is certainly the case, then it makes sense to keep greenhouse gases in check only if the alternative, which is to adapt to global warming, is equally or more costly. For two key sectors of the economy, however, this is decidedly not the case. We will not all go hungry or run out of wood products if temperatures rise. To the contrary, agricultural and forestry impacts will be modest at most, at least on a global scale. Furthermore, successful adaptation in the two sectors will not require central planning by governments. To the contrary, adaptation is best accomplished by relying on the sort of decision-making that happens routinely in competitive and unregulated markets. Government can be, and often is, the source of harm. The harm will be multiplied if the earth grows warmer. Indeed, waste and misallocation created by these policies will almost certainly exceed the costs which occur in commodity markets because of climate change. In the final analysis, much of the alarmist literature about the effects of global warming boils down to the claim that individuals, firms, and entire economies which refuse to adjust in any way to environmental flux will suffer harm. This is a very poor argument indeed for governmental intervention. Thank you very much.